Morgan Reyes had always believed the most dangerous thing a woman could wear was a white dress. Not because it symbolized purity, but because it demanded witnesses. It turned private longing into public proof. It promised permanence in a world built on exits. Morgan understood that danger better than anyone, because she had spent her life orchestrating it for others while quietly starving for it herself. She stood on a rooftop in Lower Manhattan, surrounded by money, laughter, and the soft violence of curated happiness. Below her, the city pulsed with indifferent life. Above her, string lights cast a flattering glow meant to erase flaws. Morgan moved through the crowd like a finished product. Successful, composed, untouchable. She was the woman clients trusted with their most expensive moments, the architect of love as spectacle. Her smile never shook, not even after sleepless nights or brutal negotiations. She looked like someone who had already won. The hook was that she hadn't. In her clutch lay a small black ring box, velvet and heavy, meant for someone else. She had picked it up hours earlier for a bride who wanted quiet luxury. Morgan's fingers kept brushing the lid as if it might open on its own. She told herself it was professional habit. She didn't tell herself the truth, that the box felt like a sealed promise she had never been given. Her phone vibrated. The name on the screen tightened something deep in her chest. Aiden Cole. She didn't answer, she didn't decline. She let it ring, then slipped the phone back into her hand as if nothing had happened. That was how it always went. Ring, silence, return, repeat. Aiden had been her scar for years. He arrived with intensity and disappeared with elegance, offering just enough tenderness to keep her hopping and just enough distance to keep her insecure. He was skilled at affection without accountability, intimacy without commitment. Morgan had learned to call it chemistry. Later, she learned to call it control. She had told herself she was done. After the last early morning departure, after the flowers that felt like hush money, after the apologies that named no mistakes, she had rehearsed her ending with him in therapy, with friends, alone in the mirror. She had meant it every time. Still, her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Across the rooftop, a couple posed for photos against a skyline backdrop. The woman raised her hand, ring flashing, smile sharp with triumph. The man's grip on her waist looked more possessive than loving. Morgan recognized the performance instantly. The audience didn't care if it was real. They only cared if it looked inevitable. A hush rippled through the crowd. Morgan felt it before she saw him. Aiden entered the space like it belonged to him. Calm, unrushed, certain. He wore confidence the way some men wore cologne, subtle, invasive, impossible to ignore. He didn't need to look for Morgan. He already knew where she would be. She turned and saw him exactly as memory preserved him. Tailored suit, open collar, a face that never revealed effort. He didn't look apologetic. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who assumed access. Morgan moved toward the elevator before he reached her. Not running, not dramatic, just refusing to play the scene he expected. She felt him follow, not close enough to chase, not far enough to respect distance. He had always mastered that balance. The elevator mirror caught them both. Two beautiful people in a narrow frame, a perfect image. The kind strangers would mistake for love. Morgan studied her own reflection and saw what she hated most. Eyes too alert, like a body trained for impact. That wasn't desire. It was conditioning. Outside, the cold air cut clean. The city roared back into her ears, alive and careless. Aiden matched her pace, his presence pressing against her without contact. That was his talent. He took space without asking. At the curb, the light turned red. Morgan stopped. The pause felt like a trap snapping shut. Aiden spoke then, calm and controlled, offering his favorite solution, starting over. Not changing, resetting. As if their history were a draft that could be rewritten without cost. As if waiting had been romantic instead of corrosive. Morgan stared at the red reflection bleeding across wet pavement. In that moment, something finally broke, not into sadness, but into clarity. Disgust rose sharp and unmistakable. Not just for him, for herself. For the years she had spent translating neglect into patience, for calling uncertainty depth, for waiting like it was loyalty. She saw herself clearly now, a woman who built certainty for others because she had never been given her own. She turned her head and looked at Aiden fully. He looked at her like a man offering mercy, not realizing that mercy without change was just another form of control. Morgan opened her car door and got inside alone. Aiden stood in the rain, faintly smiling, as if time were still on his side. That smile told her everything. He didn't believe in endings. Morgan closed her eyes and acted before fear could argue. She blocked his number. Then every version of him, every app, every door he had used to return. The finality landed like a physical blow. Her hands shook. She hated that they shook. She hated that cutting him out felt like amputation. She hated that her body still remembered him even as her mind rejected him. She looked down at the ring box again. Velvet, perfect, false certainty. Back in her apartment, the silence was louder than the city. Morgan stripped the space of him with surgical precision. Toothbrush, hoodie, photos, message threads that showed him at his best because those were the ones that lied most convincingly. She threw things away, then washed her hands under scalding water until the shaking stopped. Sleep didn't come. Quiet never had. Near dawn, she opened her email to escape her thoughts. Work had always been safer than reflection. Her inbox overflowed with other people's dreams, budgets, confirmations, mood boards. Control disguised as romance. Then she saw the invitation she had ignored days earlier. A private matchmaking club, discreet, curated, exclusive, designed for people who believed destiny could be outsourced. Morgan had heard of it through whispers at after-parties, through women who smiled while talking about it and looked hollow when they thought no one noticed. She read the message again. She wasn't looking for love. She was looking for an exit, a door out of the loop she had lived in for years. Her thumb hovered. Hesitation had always kept her safe and trapped at the same time. She pressed confirm. Attendance confirmed. The words stared back at her, clean and final. A thrill moved through her, sharp and uneasy. She told herself this was control. She told herself this was choice. What she didn't admit was that she had just stepped into another kind of darkness, one dressed in elegance and confidentiality. By morning, Aiden tried to reach her again, from new numbers, new emails, mutual contacts. Morgan ignored them all. Each attempt felt less like love and more like a bid to reclaim ownership. She went to work and functioned flawlessly. She negotiated contracts. She calmed anxious brides. She sold certainty while privately dismantling her own illusions. At lunch, she passed a bridal boutique and caught her reflection layered over faceless mannequins in ivory gowns. The image made her recoil. She saw how easily a dress could become a mask. That night, alone in her apartment, Morgan reread the club's details. Discretion, confidentiality, no names disclosed. It didn't sound like romance. It sounded like leverage. She should have been alarmed. Instead, she felt hungry. Morgan stood in front of the mirror and removed her makeup, watching the armor fall away. Without it, she looked younger, sharper, dangerous in a quieter way. She didn't promise herself happiness. She promised herself one thing only: she would never again be half-chosen. She turned off the light and let the city hum through the dark. Somewhere ahead waited a door she hadn't opened yet. Somewhere behind, a man still believed she would come back. Morgan didn't know that the path she had chosen would lead her toward power disguised as love, toward a wedding built on ash instead of innocence. She only knew she had pressed confirm. And that was enough to change everything. Morgan Reyes arrived at the private dining club believing she was walking into a controlled environment. The building itself reinforced the illusion. No visible signage, no windows at street level, a discreet entrance guarded by men who did not look like security so much as inevitability. Inside, the air carried the muted confidence of money that never needed to announce itself. Everything was intentional. Everything was curated. It felt less like a social gathering and more like a rehearsal for power. The event unfolded like an elite performance. Guests were arranged rather than gathered, positioned into small clusters that suggested compatibility without forcing interaction. Lighting softened faces without flattering them. Music existed only as a background suggestion, carefully chosen not to interrupt thought. Morgan recognized the architecture of manipulation immediately. She had designed spaces like this herself, environments that nudged people toward decisions they believed were their own. She moved through the room with professional composure, observing rather than participating. She noted how people assessed one another, glances lingering half a second too long, smiles measured, bodies angled defensively. Everyone here had something to gain, and everyone knew it. The desperation was simply better dressed. That was when she noticed the man, who did not belong to the choreography. He stood slightly apart from the others, close enough to observe everything, far enough to remain untouched by it. He was not engaging, not circulating, not advertising himself. He watched the room the way one might watch a system rather than a crowd. Morgan recognized the posture instantly. It was the posture of someone guarding a secret that was not his to reveal. His name, she would later learn, was Noah Harper. At first glance, he did not register as dangerous. He looked composed, restrained, deliberately unremarkable in the way men with real influence often were. His suit was impeccable but understated. His expression neutral, bordering on distant. He did not scan the room for opportunity. He scanned it for threats. Morgan sensed, without understanding why, that he was not there for himself. When his gaze met hers, it did not linger. That alone distinguished him from every other man in the room. It was Noah who approached her, but not immediately. He waited until she had circled the space once, until she had begun to look restless rather than curious. He timed his movement precisely, intercepting her path near a side corridor where the noise thinned and privacy thickened. He did not smile when he addressed her. He did not flirt. He did not pretend coincidence. He spoke to her, as one professional to another. What he offered her did not come wrapped in romance. It came wrapped in efficiency. A proposal, not for dating, not for companionship, for a role. A fixed-term marriage, 12 months, clear conditions, defined outcomes, absolute discretion. Morgan did not react outwardly. Years in her industry had trained her face to remain neutral under shock. Internally, something sparked, not excitement, not fear, but recognition. The shape of the offer matched a hunger she had not named aloud. The man behind the proposal, Noah explained, was not present tonight. Cal Blackwell did not attend gatherings like this. His name moved through the room in whispers instead, carrying the weight of rumor and warning. He was the heir to a Boston-based technology empire, temporarily installed as its head, while his father's health deteriorated behind closed doors. Publicly, the family maintained silence. Privately, the industry buzzed with speculation. Lawsuits postponed, acquisitions stalled, a ticking clock attached to an inheritance clause no one could quite define. One detail, however, had leaked. Cal Blackwell was required to marry before the end of the year. Morgan understood leverage when she heard it. She also understood risk. Noah did not oversell. He laid out facts with surgical calm. The arrangement was legal. The compensation was significant enough to erase not only debt but anxiety. The wedding would be funded without limitation, curated to a level that would dominate social media cycles and silence doubt. In return, Morgan would offer legitimacy, stability, and the appearance of permanence. Emotional involvement was neither expected nor desired. Morgan felt the danger immediately, and she felt, just as strongly, the pull. She asked for time, not because she needed it, but because refusing too quickly would have been a lie. Noah gave her space without pressure. He did not follow up. He did not push. That restraint told her more than persuasion ever could. 2 days later, Morgan found herself entering a restaurant where silence was treated as luxury. The space was dim without being intimate, designed to discourage vulnerability rather than encourage it. The staff moved like shadows, efficient and invisible. This was not a place where people fell in love. This was a place where decisions were finalized. Cal Blackwell was already seated when she arrived. He did not stand. He did not rush. He acknowledged her presence with a controlled inclination of his head, as if greeting an equal rather than an applicant. Morgan registered his appearance in fragments. Sharp lines, disciplined posture, eyes that did not search but assessed. He was not conventionally handsome. He was precise. His attractiveness lay in restraint, in the sense that nothing about him existed by accident. There was no small talk, no attempt at charm. Cal approached the meeting the way one approached a merger. He presented the situation plainly, without apology or embellishment. His need for marriage was not emotional. It was structural, a requirement embedded in legal language and family expectation. He did not pretend otherwise. Morgan appreciated that more than she wanted to. The contract rested between them on the table, a physical presence as cold and deliberate as Cal himself. It detailed timelines, appearances, obligations, and boundaries. No intimacy clause, no expectation of cohabitation beyond public necessity, no exclusivity beyond optics. Everything had been reduced to terms. Morgan read carefully. She always did. What unsettled her was not the lack of romance. It was the absence of deception. Cal did not promise happiness. He did not promise transformation. He promised stability, resources, and silence. In his world, those were the highest currencies. Morgan surprised herself by pushing back, not on money, but on meaning. She explained that for her, a wedding was not decoration. It was declaration. She did not need love, but she needed authenticity of intent. She needed the ceremony to be treated as something more than a press release. Not because she was sentimental, but because she refused to turn herself into a disposable asset. Cal listened without interruption. When she finished, he did not challenge her interpretation. He did not mock it. He did not attempt to reframe her need into something smaller. He accepted it as a variable, neither validating nor dismissing it. That, more than anything, unsettled her. They negotiated, slowly, intelligently, with mutual respect sharpened by caution. When they reached the financial terms, Morgan did not flinch. The number was immense. It represented freedom, not excess. It represented options she had never allowed herself to imagine without fear. She recognized the temptation not as greed, but as relief. When they reached the wedding terms, Morgan asserted control. She demanded involvement, vision, authority. This was not ego, it was survival. Cal agreed, though the consent felt calculated rather than generous. He understood that giving her control here would cost him less than resisting it. They signed the contract before dessert arrived. The pen felt heavier than expected in Morgan's hand. She was acutely aware of the moment, of the way ink on paper could reorder a life. She signed with steady precision, refusing ceremony even as she entered into its most artificial form. Only after the signatures were complete did Morgan notice the final clause. Confidentiality. It extended beyond standard discretion. It covered not only the arrangement, but its origin, its motivations, and its termination. Violations carried consequences that were not merely financial. The language was careful, layered, designed by lawyers who anticipated betrayal as a natural outcome rather than an exception. Morgan felt the first true chill of the evening. She asked about it. Cal met her gaze evenly. He did not soften. He did not explain more than necessary. He framed it as protection of reputation, of family, of infrastructure. His world, it became clear, was not built on trust. It was built on containment. Morgan understood then that this was not simply a marriage of convenience. It was an alignment with a system that defended itself aggressively. The contract was not a bridge. It was a boundary. She should have walked away. Instead, she signed. The moment the pen lifted, her life split cleanly into before and after. Before had been uncertainty masked as freedom. After was certainty wrapped in danger. As she left the restaurant, Noah Harper waited outside as if he had never moved. He did not ask how it went. He did not congratulate her. He simply acknowledged the shift with a nod that suggested he had expected this outcome all along. Morgan stepped into the night with the contract secured inside her bag, her pulse steady, her thoughts anything but. She told herself she had made a strategic decision. She told herself this was control. She told herself she had finally chosen certainty over waiting. What she did not yet allow herself to consider was the cost of aligning with men who treated power as a language and intimacy as a liability. The contract felt solid in her hands. Too solid. And somewhere inside its final clause, something had already begun to move. Morgan Reyes discovered very quickly that planning a wedding without a groom was like building a cathedral while the god it was meant for refused to enter the room. The process consumed her days in layers of fabric, architecture, light, and logistics, yet the center remained hollow. Venues blurred together into variations of controlled beauty. Silk samples slipped through her fingers like water. Guest lists became exercises in optics rather than intimacy. Everything was expensive. Everything was flawless. Nothing felt alive. Cal Blackwell existed in this process, mostly as an absence. When he appeared, it was briefly and efficiently, like an executive reviewing a report rather than a man approaching marriage. Messages arrived short and exact, stripped of tone. Approvals came quickly, without curiosity. The ring was purchased with the same decisiveness he used to close deals, its specifications selected for impact rather than sentiment. He treated the wedding as infrastructure, something that needed to function, not something that needed to breathe. Morgan told herself she could live with that. She had agreed to structure, not fantasy. Yet what unsettled her was not Cal's control over money, but his control over meaning. When he suggested trusting professionals and installed a renowned planner without consulting her, something sharp twisted inside her. The planner was brilliant, efficient, globally respected. She solved problems before they surfaced. She spoke in timelines and deliverables. She erased uncertainty with competence. And she erased Morgan with it. Morgan realized that the dream she had carried since childhood was slipping away not because of compromise, but because it was being optimized. The wedding was becoming perfect in every measurable way and completely detached from her inner life. She had wanted to build it herself, piece by piece, as proof that she was finally chosen. Instead, she was watching it assembled around her like a set designed for someone else's story. It was in this hollow space that Noah Harper became constant. He did not announce his presence. He simply appeared where pressure accumulated, at tastings where Morgan's patience thinned, at fittings where decisions multiplied until they blurred, at meetings where vendors spoke over her, assuming approval would come from a signature rather than a person. Noah intercepted, clarified, slowed the pace. He translated chaos into order without claiming ownership of it. He watched Morgan the way one watches weather rather than prey. He noticed when her shoulders tightened, when her focus fractured, when the word contract made her expression go distant. He never corrected her choices. He asked questions that framed them. He created space rather than filling it. There was no flirtation, no obvious intention. That was what made it dangerous. With Noah, Morgan did not feel evaluated. She felt witnessed. She began to notice how often Cal deferred to Noah without acknowledging it, how decisions passed through him quietly, like power rerouted through a less visible channel. Noah never contradicted Cal publicly. He simply absorbed impact and redistributed it elsewhere. Morgan sensed that he understood the machinery of the Blackwell world more deeply than he let on. Time rearranged itself around Noah's presence. Meetings ended sooner. Problems dissolved faster. Morgan found herself breathing more evenly when he was near. The relief was subtle, cumulative, and profoundly unsettling. Because ease had never been safe for her. She had learned early that comfort came with conditions, that attention was temporary, that stability demanded performance. With Aiden, ease had always been followed by disappearance. With Cal, ease was replaced by distance. Noah offered something different, steadiness without claim. That steadiness began to feel essential. Morgan caught herself listening for his footsteps in unfamiliar spaces. She noticed the absence of her usual anxiety when her phone stayed silent, because she was no longer waiting for Cal's messages. She was waiting for Noah's quiet check-ins, his efficient updates, his calm presence that never asked for more. The realization frightened her more than any warning sign could have. At the same time, the past refused to stay buried. Aiden returned the way he always did when control slipped from his grasp. Not loudly, not desperately, but persistently. He appeared at cafes near her office, at intersections she crossed out of habit, at social spaces where coincidence felt rehearsed. His apologies carried more urgency now, more polish. He spoke of growth, of realization, of readiness. He offered exactly what she had once begged for, timed precisely to destabilize her resolve. Morgan recognized the pattern immediately. This was escalation, not transformation. Aiden was not changing. He was bidding higher because the asset was leaving his possession. The difference now was clarity. Where once his presence had confused her, now it sharpened her awareness. She saw the mechanics beneath his affection, the way his remorse surfaced only when threatened, the way his promises expanded in proportion to his fear. His sincerity was real, but it was self-centered. He wanted relief from loss, not accountability for damage. Yet even with clarity, his return unsettled her. Not because she wanted him back, but because history had weight. He represented familiarity, and familiarity was powerful. His timing, layered over the sterile perfection of wedding planning, turned her days into something darker than stress. It felt like surveillance, like pressure building beneath white Dacre. The wedding began to resemble a controlled thriller, rather than a celebration. Everywhere Morgan turned, she felt watched by different versions of herself. The woman who had waited, the woman who had signed, the woman who was drifting toward something unnamed. Noah never commented on Aiden's appearances, but Morgan sensed his awareness. It surfaced in small adjustments, meetings rescheduled, routes altered, buffers placed between her and intrusion. He did not ask questions. He anticipated needs. That anticipation deepened the danger. Because Morgan had built her life around managing expectations, not being cared for without negotiation. Noah's attention did not demand reciprocity. It existed without invoice. And that, more than charm or desire, destabilized her sense of control. She told herself it was proximity, logistics, shared responsibility. She told herself it would fade once the wedding reached momentum. Instead, it intensified. Late evenings blurred into long planning sessions where exhaustion lowered her defenses. Noah remained composed, even when she faltered. He did not rush her decisions. He did not correct her uncertainty. He allowed silence to exist without filling it. In that silence, Morgan felt something unfamiliar: safety. The word frightened her. Safety implied trust. Trust implied vulnerability. Vulnerability implied loss. She began sleeping poorly, not from anxiety, but from anticipation she could not name. Her dreams shifted. The wedding appeared without faces, a ring without a hand, a voice speaking behind her that never resolved into identity. Cal remained distant, increasingly absorbed in matters Morgan was not permitted to understand. His messages became more functional, less frequent. When he did appear, it was with the distracted presence of a man managing risk rather than building a future. He spoke of optics, of timing, of necessity, never of desire. Morgan found herself wondering whether Cal saw her at all, or whether she existed to him as a solution with a face. That question lingered, unanswered. The deeper Morgan moved into preparation, the more she sensed a parallel process unfolding beyond her reach. Decisions were being made around her, not with her. The confidentiality clause pressed against her thoughts like a locked door she had agreed not to open. It was Noah who inadvertently cracked it. The moment came without ceremony. A corridor, a pause, a voice lowered out of habit rather than secrecy. Morgan did not intend to listen. She did not intend to learn anything. She simply happened to be there when Noah spoke into his phone with a tension she had not seen before. His tone was controlled but not calm, purposeful but edged. She caught only a fragment, enough to rearrange her understanding. He said that she could not know yet, that the timing mattered, that if she learned the reason before the ceremony, everything would collapse. Morgan did not hear the reply. She did not hear the explanation. She did not need to. The implications struck with surgical precision. The marriage was not just a legal arrangement. It was not merely an inheritance requirement or a public maneuver. It was a sequence, a plan with dependencies, and she was positioned inside it with intention. For the first time since signing the contract, fear replaced curiosity. Morgan stood frozen, her mind racing through possibilities. The confidentiality clause, the urgency, Cal's distance, Noah's vigilance. Pieces aligned into a shape she did not yet understand but recognized as dangerous. She realized then that she had mistaken proximity for coincidence. Noah's presence was not accidental. His steadiness was not merely professional. He was not only a facilitator, he was a gatekeeper. And she was not simply a bride. She was a variable. The realization did not drive her away. It did something far worse. It pulled her deeper. Because beneath the fear was something else, something darker and more compelling. The sense that she had stepped into a narrative larger than her own longing. That the wedding was not just a mask, but a trigger. That power was moving around her, and she was finally close enough to feel its heat. Morgan returned home that night with the weight of white fabric and hidden intentions pressing against her chest. She stared at her reflection and saw a woman standing at the edge of knowledge, torn between retreat and revelation. She understood now that the shadow beside her was not there by accident, and that whatever waited beyond, the ceremony had already begun. Pressure did not arrive all at once. It accumulated the way water did behind a dam, silent and patient, until every structure Morgan Reyes had built around herself began to hum with strain. What had once felt like control now felt like surveillance. What had once looked like choice now resembled confinement dressed in silk and glass. Aiden was the first to change his tactics. He stopped pretending to be gentle. His presence grew sharper, more deliberate, as if he had accepted that tenderness would no longer grant him access. He appeared where Morgan could not easily avoid him, no longer relying on coincidence but on knowledge. He remembered her routines better than she wanted to admit. He positioned himself near her past, places she had once loved, streets she had walked when she still believed in him, spaces that carried memory like a loaded weapon. His apologies transformed into accusations wrapped in concern. His affection became conditional. He pressed against the old fault lines she had spent years trying to seal, reminding her, without ever saying it directly, of the version of herself that had existed before success, before contracts, before men in tailored suits offered her certainty in exchange for silence. He framed himself as history, as inevitability, as the only witness to her unguarded self. Morgan recognized the strategy with painful clarity. This was not love fighting to survive. This was control attempting to reassert dominance. Aiden did not fear losing her affection. He feared losing relevance. The more she resisted, the more he escalated, tightening his grip on her perception of herself. He wanted her smaller, doubt-filled, grateful that someone still wanted her at all. At the same time, Cal Blackwell shifted from absence to possession. Where he had once maintained distance, he now closed ranks. His communications grew more frequent, more directive. He began to frame suggestions as requirements, preferences as expectations. He corrected her phrasing before public appearances. He adjusted schedules without consultation. He dictated how the engagement should be discussed, which narratives were acceptable, which details were off-limits. Cal did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He didn't need to. Authority lived in his certainty. Morgan felt the change immediately. His attention did not feel like interest. It felt like inventory. She was no longer a collaborator in the arrangement. She was an asset whose value depended on predictability. He spoke of optics, of risk mitigation, of minimizing variables. And in his eyes, Morgan saw herself becoming exactly that, a variable to be managed. The more Cal asserted control, the more Morgan felt the contract tightening around her ribs. She had agreed to structure, not erasure. She had agreed to performance, not ownership. Yet every directive chipped away at the illusion that she had entered this arrangement as an equal. She began to feel purchased rather than partnered. Noah Harper remained the only constant who did not demand anything. And that was precisely what made him dangerous. He did not counter Cal openly, but he resisted quietly. He rerouted decisions. He delayed implementations. He framed Morgan's preferences as logistical necessities rather than emotional requests, protecting her without exposing her. His presence created a buffer that allowed her to breathe, even as the walls closed in. With Noah, Morgan felt present in her own body again. Her thoughts slowed. Her defenses lowered. She noticed small things she had trained herself to ignore. The way he matched her pace without guiding it, the way he absorbed tension from a room without redirecting it toward her, the way he listened without preparing a response. Their closeness did not arrive with intention. It emerged through repetition, through shared exhaustion, through moments where her mask slipped and he did not reach to fix it, through silences that did not demand explanation. This was more dangerous than seduction. Because seduction announced itself, it gave warning, ease did not. Morgan began to measure time differently. Days felt distorted, stretched thin between pressure points. Nights carried a weight that made sleep shallow and restless. She caught herself thinking about Noah when she should have been thinking about logistics. She noticed her body responding to his presence in ways that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with relief. That relief frightened her more than fear ever had. She attempted to correct course the way she always had, by compartmentalizing, by treating the connection as incidental, temporary, an illusion created by proximity and stress. She returned to the plan, to the schedule, to the contract. She told herself that emotions were noise and noise could be filtered out. But this time, the system did not respond. Because the emotions she was experiencing were not chaotic, they were clarifying. The world no longer snapped back into place when she asserted control. It resisted. It warped. The more she tried to flatten reality into something manageable, the more it revealed depth she could not ignore. Then came the morning that redefined everything. Morgan arrived at a planning session prepared to defend her vision, already bracing for compromise. Instead, she discovered the battle had already been fought and lost without her. Documents had been signed, vendors replaced, decisions finalized. Her carefully constructed framework had been overwritten by authority she did not hold. Cal had altered the wedding structure unilaterally. He had removed her from the process as efficiently as one removed redundant costs. Her role had been reduced to appearance rather than authorship. The wedding, she realized, was no longer something she was building. It was something she was being placed inside. The realization landed with surgical brutality. Cal was not marrying her. He was marrying the procedure, the compliance, the outcome. And her dream, her long-held, fiercely guarded vision of being chosen publicly and unequivocally, had once again been transformed into someone else's instrument. The betrayal did not explode. It hollowed. Morgan felt something go quiet inside her, a deep internal click as illusion disengaged from hope. This was the moment she understood that control without consent was not partnership. It was occupation. Around her, the machinery continued to move. Schedules adjusted, emails sent, assumptions made. No one asked her how she felt because how she felt was irrelevant to the objective. Noah noticed immediately. He did not approach her with consolation. He approached her with precision. He challenged the changes not emotionally, but structurally. He asked questions that exposed gaps. He highlighted risks Cal had ignored. He slowed the implementation just enough to create friction. Morgan observed their interactions closely for the first time. What she saw unsettled her. The tension between Cal and Noah was not new. It carried history, weight, something unresolved and sharp beneath the professional surface. Their exchanges were clipped, controlled, edged with something personal that had never healed. Morgan sensed debts beneath the dialogue, obligations enforced through leverage rather than loyalty. Noah's resistance was not rebellion. It was containment. He was holding something back. That awareness sharpened Morgan's perception. She began to see patterns where she had once seen coincidence. Noah's proximity, Cal's reliance, the confidentiality clause that extended far beyond reason, the urgency that surrounded the ceremony itself. This was not merely about inheritance or image. Something larger was in motion. The confirmation arrived not through confrontation, but through silence. Morgan received an envelope with no return address. Inside, a single page, no greeting, no explanation, only facts laid out with legal precision. It outlined a series of pending actions within the Blackwell corporate structure, all contingent on the finalization of her marriage. Lawsuits deferred, assets frozen, jurisdictional shifts scheduled to activate after the ceremony. At the bottom, one sentence stood alone. If she signed the final documents, she would become legally entangled in a corporate conflict that predated her involvement and would outlast the marriage itself. Her wedding was not the endgame. It was the trigger. Morgan sat with the paper for a long time, the silence around her thick and oppressive. The fantasy she had built since childhood collapsed under the weight of truth. The white dress, the applause, the proof of being chosen. All of it had been repurposed into leverage for a war she did not understand and had never consented to fight. Fear arrived late, but when it came, it was precise. Not fear of Cal, not fear of Aiden, fear of herself. Fear that she had once again mistaken proximity for safety. Fear that she had allowed herself to be positioned rather than protected. Fear that her desire to be chosen had made her vulnerable to forces that thrived on hunger. Aiden represented her past, clawing to reclaim relevance through intimidation and familiarity. Cal represented power without intimacy, certainty without care, a system that consumed people as resources. And Noah stood between them, offering neither claim nor guarantee, only presence and restraint, carrying secrets heavy enough to bend the air around him. 3 men, 3 forms of control. And Morgan stood at the center, forced to confront the truth she had avoided her entire life. Choosing the wrong form of certainty was more dangerous than choosing uncertainty at all. The dream she had chased for decades did not need to be postponed. It needed to be destroyed. Because as long as it existed, others would keep using it against her. The realization did not bring relief. It brought grief. Not for the wedding, but for the version of herself who had believed a ceremony could save her from being alone. Morgan folded the anonymous letter and placed it inside her bag, feeling the weight of it settle like a verdict. She understood now that whatever choice lay ahead would not preserve the dream. It would kill it. And only then would something real be possible. Morgan Reyes woke up to silence that felt unfamiliar rather than peaceful. It was the first morning since signing the contract when she did not reach instinctively for her phone to check schedules, messages, or confirmations. The absence of urgency was not relief. It was exposure. For the first time in years, she stood without the scaffolding of a future she had been using as armor. The idea of the perfect wedding had collapsed, and with it fell the structure that had held her upright through uncertainty, disappointment, and fear. Without it, she felt unmoored. Not lost, but raw. As if something essential had been stripped away and she was forced to look at what remained underneath. She realized then how thoroughly the fantasy had occupied her inner life. The white dress had never been about romance. It had been a shield, a declaration loud enough to silence doubt, a public proof that would make abandonment impossible. She had chased it with the intensity of someone who believed survival depended on ceremony. Now that belief lay broken, and the wreckage demanded examination. Morgan sought her mother not for instruction, but for orientation. She did not want reassurance or approval. She wanted truth without polish. Sitting in the quiet space of her childhood home, surrounded by objects that had existed before ambition reshaped her, she felt the weight of generational expectation pressing gently but persistently against her chest. Her mother listened without interruption, without urgency to fix or correct. That restraint allowed something long buried to surface. Morgan understood, with a clarity that hurt, that she had never truly dreamed of marriage. She had dreamed of permanence, of being irreplaceable, of removing the option of being left. The wedding had been her attempt to manufacture certainty in a world that had taught her how easily people disappeared. That certainty, she now saw, could not be purchased. Not with Aiden's flowers, timed to arrive when guilt sharpened his fear of loss. Not with Cal's money, precise and overwhelming, offered as insulation against instability. Not even with Noah's quiet protection, which felt real but remained tethered to secrets she did not control. This realization did not arrive with drama. It settled slowly, like ash after fire, coating everything with the same muted truth. The first chain she broke was the oldest. Aiden's presence had shifted from intrusion to threat. His attempts to reach her grew more insistent, less veiled. He framed his persistence as devotion, his aggression as concern. He invoked memory like a debt, implying that shared history obligated her to grant him access. But Morgan no longer felt pulled into negotiation. She saw the pattern clearly now, stripped of nostalgia. When she closed the door on him for the final time, it was not an act of triumph. It was an act of neutrality. She did not argue. She did not defend. She did not explain. She simply refused to participate. That refusal unsettled him more than anger ever could. For Morgan, the moment carried a quiet gravity. She was not choosing another man. She was choosing the end of a game that had required her to perform worthiness in exchange for conditional affection. She felt grief, but it was clean. It belonged to the past, not the future. Breaking free from Aiden did not resolve her situation. It clarified it. Cal Blackwell did not respond to clarity with understanding. He responded with enforcement. He reminded her of obligations, of signatures, of the scale of investment already deployed. He framed the arrangement as irreversible momentum rather than mutual agreement. His language was measured, controlled, entirely devoid of emotion. This was how power asserted itself when challenged, not with threats, but with inevitability. Morgan recognized the dynamic instantly. This was authority untempered by empathy. It did not ask, it collected. And yet, she did not tear the contract apart. Not because she feared Cal, though she did. Not because she wanted the wedding, though remnants of the old desire still flickered. She held back because she sensed there was more beneath the surface. Something unfinished. Something that required understanding before action. She needed the full truth. Cal's world was built on opacity. Every answer led to another locked door. Every explanation felt partial, strategically incomplete. The more Morgan pressed, the more she sensed that the wedding was not an end, but a mechanism. A trigger designed to activate a sequence of outcomes unrelated to love or partnership. Her attention turned, inevitably, to Noah Harper. He remained close, but altered. More guarded, more deliberate. His presence no longer felt merely protective. It felt weighted, as if each interaction carried unspoken consequence. Morgan noticed how carefully he chose his words, how often he watched her reactions rather than the room, how his composure tightened when certain subjects surfaced. She began to suspect that his proximity to her was not coincidence, nor solely professional alignment. Fragments of truth surfaced through research rather than confession. Legal records buried beneath corporate restructuring. A defunct subsidiary tied to a scandal never fully resolved. Names that recurred in filings like echoes of damage. And threaded through it all, a familiar absence, accountability. The Blackwell family had survived by absorbing loss and redirecting blame. Careers had ended quietly. Reputations had been erased without ceremony. Among the casualties, Morgan found Noah's past. He had not always been an assistant. Years earlier, he had been something else entirely, an innovator, a strategist, a partner operating adjacent to the Blackwell empire. When the scandal broke, he had lost everything that could be quantified. Company, standing, leverage. What remained was proximity. A position close enough to observe but not to influence openly. A role defined by silence. Noah's loyalty was not devotion. It was debt. And Morgan stood at the intersection of that debt and Cal's inheritance. The final confirmation arrived in pieces. A legal analysis from a source she trusted. A timeline mapped against corporate transitions. A pattern too consistent to ignore. The inheritance clause did not merely require marriage. It required optics. A flawless public image capable of stabilizing investor confidence long enough to bury unresolved liabilities. Morgan was not being married into the family. She was being used as a seal. Her public role as the elegant, uncontroversial bride would legitimize a transfer of power that allowed Cal to secure control while suppressing the past. The confidentiality clause was not protection. It was containment. It ensured that when the fallout arrived, it would not reach the surface. And Noah's position made sense in that context. He was both witness and weapon. Bound to the family by loss, positioned to ensure compliance, yet close enough to recognize the cost. Morgan understood then why he sometimes looked at her as if he already knew the outcome. Why his protection felt urgent rather than optional. Why his silence carried tension rather than calm. She was not a random participant. She was a variable introduced intentionally. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily. Morgan felt anger, but it was measured. She felt fear, but it was controlled. What surprised her most was resolve. For the first time, she saw the entire structure clearly. Aiden representing emotional captivity, Cal embodying institutional power, Noah standing as the embodiment of consequence. Three forces converging around her not because she was weak, but because she was useful. The realization shifted something fundamental. She was done being useful. Morgan did not confront Cal immediately. She did not accuse Noah. She did not collapse under the pressure of revelation. Instead, she grew still. She watched. She gathered information. She recalibrated her understanding of leverage. Chains did not always rattle when they were present. Sometimes they tightened silently, disguised as opportunity. And breaking them required patience, not force. Morgan stood alone that night in her apartment, contract laid open, documents spread like evidence. The city outside glowed with indifference. She felt no comfort in its familiarity, only clarity. She had entered this arrangement believing she was buying certainty. She now knew she had been positioned as collateral. The dream was dead, completely. But in its absence, something sharper emerged. Not hope. Agency. Morgan closed the folder slowly, deliberately. Whatever came next would not preserve appearances. It would not protect reputations. It would not satisfy expectations built on silence. It would cost her something. And for the first time, she was ready to pay a price that belonged to her alone. The wedding unfolded exactly as it had been designed to. Light spilled across polished stone and glass, softened by careful angles and expensive filters. Music moved through the space like a controlled pulse, neither intrusive nor intimate, calibrated to signal significance rather than emotion. Cameras hovered at the perimeter, their lenses hungry and disciplined, waiting to capture proof of perfection. Every detail aligned with the fantasy millions of people consumed daily without questioning its cost. Morgan Reyes stood at the center of it all and felt nothing resembling joy. She felt clarity. The dress fit her flawlessly, tailored to emphasize elegance without vulnerability. It moved with her like a second skin, light enough to suggest freedom, structured enough to enforce posture. She recognized the craftsmanship immediately. It was the kind of garment designed to disappear into photographs while amplifying the wearer's value. She had approved it weeks ago with the same precision she brought to every other decision, yet now it felt less like adornment and more like armor. Around her, the ceremony performed itself. Guests settled into their roles, their expressions polished and anticipatory. The audience was not here to witness intimacy. They were here to validate outcome. Applause waited in their throats like a reflex, ready to release on cue. Morgan observed them the way she had observed countless weddings before, with professional detachment sharpened by personal stakes. She saw the hunger for narrative in their eyes, the desire to believe in a story that required no responsibility from its witnesses. Cal Blackwell stood beside her, immaculate and composed. His presence radiated success with surgical efficiency. His smile appeared precisely when expected, measured and controlled, identical to the expressions he wore at press conferences and board announcements. He looked like a man who had already crossed the finish line and was now pausing only for documentation. It was that expression that unsettled her most. Cal did not look nervous. He did not look hopeful. He did not look transformed by the gravity of the moment. He looked victorious. And victory, Morgan understood, was the most dangerous emotion of all when it was achieved without cost. She watched him from the corner of her vision and recognized the truth she had been circling for weeks. If she took the next step, she would not simply be married for a year. She would be embedded, legally, publicly, strategically. The ceremony was not a beginning. It was an anchor designed to keep her in place while power rearranged itself around her. This realization did not arrive as panic. It arrived as stillness. Time slowed, sound dulled. The world narrowed to a single decision suspended between breath and consequence. Morgan felt the weight of every chain she had already broken and every chain she was still wearing. She thought of the girl who had believed a wedding could protect her. She thought of the woman who had learned to sell certainty to others while starving herself of truth. She understood then that the fantasy had reached its final form. Perfection without love was not neutral. It was violent. Morgan stepped forward as expected, her movements fluid, her expression serene. To an outside observer, nothing appeared wrong. This was what made the moment so dangerous. The machinery of spectacle functioned flawlessly, indifferent to internal rupture. The audience leaned in, sensing significance without understanding its shape. She reached the point where compliance was assumed, and stopped. The silence that followed was not immediate. The system lagged. Music continued for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Cameras adjusted, seeking confirmation. Cal's expression remained unchanged because he did not yet recognize disruption. He had never accounted for refusal. Morgan did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She did not dramatize her defiance. She simply withdrew consent. In that withdrawal, everything fractured. The illusion collapsed not with noise, but with absence. The absence of obedience. The absence of performance. The absence of the function she had been assigned. Morgan felt the space open around her, raw and exposed. She did not rush to fill it. She allowed the discomfort to stand, unmasked. She refused to translate her decision into something palatable for consumption. She rejected the wedding not as a gesture, but as a truth. The dress, the venue, the audience, the contract, the future that had been carefully engineered to contain her, all of it fell away in that moment. She recognized the cage for what it was, no matter how beautifully it had been lined. Morgan did not speak of betrayal or manipulation. She did not accuse. She did not explain the mechanics of her entanglement. She spoke only of what she would no longer be. She would not be chosen for leverage. She would not be returned to from jealousy. She would not be purchased through legality. The simplicity of the refusal unsettled the room more than outrage ever could. Cal finally turned to look at her fully. For the first time, his composure cracked, not into vulnerability, but into calculation sharpened by threat. He recognized loss when he saw it, not emotional loss, but strategic damage. The ceremony had been the keystone. Without it, the structure destabilized. Morgan met his gaze without apology. She felt no triumph in that moment, only release. She turned away from him and toward the edge of the space where order frayed into uncertainty. That was where Noah Harper stood. He had not moved. Throughout the ceremony, he had remained exactly where he was, neither participant nor observer, his presence contained and watchful. Morgan sensed him before she saw him, the way one senses gravity rather than sound. When their eyes met, she did not see surprise. She saw recognition. Noah did not offer escape. He did not reach for her. He did not promise safety. What he offered was presence without demand. In a world that had asked her to perform, to comply, to justify, that presence felt radical. Morgan understood the choice before her with quiet certainty. It was not between men. It was between realities. Cal represented a future secured by power, stripped of intimacy, protected by silence and enforced through obligation. Aiden, long relegated to the past, represented emotional captivity dressed as devotion, a cycle of return and retreat that would never resolve. Noah represented uncertainty paired with truth, a beginning without guarantee, a connection that carried risk because it could not be controlled. Morgan chose the risk. She moved toward Noah not as a declaration of love, but as an assertion of self. She chose the place where she did not have to negotiate her worth, where she did not have to perform certainty, where presence mattered more than optics. Noah did not look triumphant. He looked burdened, aware of the cost that would follow. He understood better than anyone what breaking this structure would provoke. The Blackwell name did not forgive disruption. Power did not retreat quietly. But he did not step away. That, Morgan realized, was the difference. She walked past the altar, past the stunned audience, past the cameras scrambling to reframe narrative. She felt the dress grow heavier with each step, no longer a symbol of promise but of history she was shedding. When she reached the edge of the space, She did not look back. The applause never came. Instead, the room dissolved into confusion, speculation, whispered damage control. Cal remained at the center, exposed in a way no press strategy could immediately repair. His victory had been interrupted, his narrative fractured. The danger he posed had not disappeared. It had simply lost its mask. Aiden existed nowhere in the moment, not defeated, not redeemed, simply irrelevant. Morgan exited into open air, the city waiting without ceremony. The sound of traffic replaced orchestrated music. Reality reclaimed its place. She felt lighter with each breath, even as uncertainty pressed close. She knew the consequences would be severe. Contracts would be contested. Reputations attacked. Power would retaliate. The secrets she had brushed against would not remain dormant. But for the first time, the risk belonged to her. Morgan stood beside Noah and felt no need to explain herself. Whatever lay ahead would not resemble safety as she had once defined it. It would require courage she had only recently discovered. She had not been rescued. She had chosen. And in that choice, she became something far more dangerous than compliant. She became free. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.